Hello, friends. This is Doug Schaible, and welcome to the Premature Bible Institute. This has been going on for quite a while, over 7 months now that we've been doing these lessons and so on, and we're just getting up to Abraham. But once again, like we talked about last week, this is almost halfway through, or right at about the halfway point of the Old Testament, chronologically speaking. So a lot of history has taken place. We haven't touched every single thing that went on in the scriptures in history because this first time going through, we're trying to establish some foundations first. And later on, those things will be filled in. But before we get to that, we want to establish some certain foundations to go through first. One of the things that we wanted to talk about a little bit about last week's lesson is we talked about how God promised that Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son within a year. So Abraham is 99, I think, Sarah is pretty close. She's really old, too, way past her age, I think almost 90. And so they're getting ready to have another child, and they're both really surprised by this, especially Sarah. But it is they believed God, and they understood that what he had said he would do, he was able to perform. So at the same time, you remember we talked about those three angels that came down, and one of those angels being the angel of the Lord, which is a reference to God coming and introducing himself to people in human form in a way that wouldn't kill them just by them seeing him. And so he comes and he tells them what he's getting ready to do over in the plains near Sodom and Gomorrah, and including those two cities that he's going down to hear to see with his own eyes. And like I say, when I say that, it sounds like God doesn't know what's going on, but he already does. But what he's wanting to do is to become personally involved in this, and to so that people will know that he's not just taking secondhand information. In other words, it's to remove all doubt about what he's getting ready to do. So he goes down there, and he sends his two angels. They go to the city of Sodom, where Lot is at, and his family. And if you remember right, he told them that they said that they wanted to stay in the center of the city, and Lot and his family said, no, please don't do that, just stay with us. So they stayed that night. The men of that city, the young and old and people from all over the city tried to come, and they wanted to rape them and do some really disgusting things with them. And the angels blinded them so that they couldn't find the door where they were at. And then the next morning, it was early in the morning, and the angels told Lot and his family to get out of the city. They were going to destroy it, and they hesitated and hung around there for a little bit, and finally the angels just took Abraham and his wife and his daughters by the hand and took them out of the city. And as a result, he destroyed everything in that area, not just Sodom, not just Gomorrah, but all the plains around there, the cities that were around there besides them, just destroyed the whole thing. It said fire and brimstone came out from heaven and just destroyed this place. So the cities and the plains were completely annihilated as a result of that. But God rescued Lot, his wife, and his daughters. But if you remember right, it says that Lot looked behind him, and she looked to where the plains were at, and it was kind of like you kind of get the impression that she wanted to go back. Well, God turned her into a pillar of salt as a result of that. And so Lot and his daughters asked God to let them go to the city of Zoar. He was afraid to go to the mountains, but then as a result of that, he was afraid of Zoar and went to the mountains like God told him to begin with. So that's kind of the whole thing. And the point of it is that God means what he says. And if he's telling Lot that he's going to destroy that place, he's going to destroy it. And so he was doing this for Abraham's sake and for Lot's sake too. Lot was a righteous man, and we read in some scriptures where it said that it vexed his righteous soul from day to day, seeing their lawless deeds and everything that was going on. It bothered him because he was a good man, but he saw a lot of unrighteous things going on there, and it just bothered him. So God fulfilled his promise, and he gave a year later, he gave Abraham and Sarah a son by the name of Isaac, and named him Isaac. And then Isaac, he grew and became a young man, and God was going to fulfill his promise through Isaac. And so he was going to give him a promise. But then Well, like here in Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 3, it says this, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said," in other words, as God had said, "and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken." And so, in other words, he fulfilled his promise to Sarah as he said he was going to do. "For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac." So you see, God did what he said he was going to do. And God was able to do this. Why? Because he's God. And God can do whatever he wants, but it will always be consistent with who he is. Does God have the power to make somebody who can't have children have children? Well, he created every atom in the universe, so I don't think it'd be too difficult for him. He has all the power to do that. And God was able to do what he said. And listen, a lot of times the reason God does things like this is so that people have know beyond any shadow of a doubt that it was God who did it, and it wasn't a thing that Abraham and Sarah tried to do. So God is God. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen that movie, The 10 Commandments. A lot of you may have, with Charlton Heston and so on. And there's a scene right at the end of the movie, and that's not in Scripture where it says this, but I think it's kind of an apt way of looking at this thing. Moses comes back to Egypt. He does his thing with Pharaoh. They go through the 10 plagues. Finally, Israel is released. They go off to do their own thing. Pharaoh gets convinced that he needs to go after them, so they run after the Israelites, intending to destroy them or bring them back into slavery. God parts the Red Sea. The Israelites go across the Red Sea on dry land, and then the Egyptians try to follow him. And as they follow him, God brings the sea back on them and drowns all of the army and everything. And there's a scene in there where Pharaoh goes back to his palace, and his wife, who was originally in love with Moses, of course this is in the movie, we don't know this for fact, but anyway, she confronts Pharaoh about this. "Well, did you do as he said?" And Pharaoh makes a statement there. After all that he saw, he said this. He said, "His God is God." And so what he was saying at that particular time, now, like I said, whether in Scripture or whether in reality he said this or not, we don't know, but I don't think he probably did. But anyway, but the statement is what is the way we should look at this. His God, Moses' God, is God. In other words, he was different than all the gods that everybody else had tried to worship, ones that were made out of trees and stones and whatever. But Moses' God was God. And so that was the point. So that's kind of what is going on here. Abraham, Sarah, and all those people up to this point, they realize that God is God. He means what he says. So Isaac now has grown. He's become an older, younger man. He's still a young man, but he's become older now. And he's working with his dad, doing all the stuff that a son would do with his son or with his father. And then God reveals himself to Abraham again. And he asks him an unusual request. And the request goes like this. In Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2, it says this, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to Abraham, and he said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.'" You think, wow. I mean, now God is asking Abraham to take the only son, the one of promise, the one that he had promised to him, take him to this land and near the Moriah, the mountain of Moriah. He says, "Take him to this land and I'll tell you where it's at when you get there." So did God know what Abraham was going to do? Of course he did. God knows everything. Like I said, he dwells in eternity. He knows everything. Now, did God have that? And here's a bigger question. Does God have the right to ask Abraham to do this? Well, yes, because as the creator, he owns everything that exists. He owns Abraham. He owns Isaac. He owns the mountain that they're going to. He owns everything. And God gave them this child. God can certainly take the child away. But we'll see more about this story as it goes on. So God knew what he was going to do. And God had the authority to ask Abraham to do this. Now, Did Isaac belong to God, or did Isaac belong to God or to Abraham? Well, ultimately he belongs to God because God created him. God brought him into this world. Both Abraham and Isaac belong to God, and Sarah, and everything else that exists. So Abraham believed God and he obeyed him. So, but I'm sure that the questions that there had to be questions in his mind, as he was going up there. Okay, if I kill my son, what's going to happen to the line of the deliverer? What's going to happen to him? And so where would all the nations come from? Remember how God told Abraham, he says, in you all families of the earth shall be blessed. So how would they be blessed if the line is going to stop here with Isaac? So what did Abraham do? What was his decision to do after he heard this? I want to share a quote. I don't know that I came up with this quote, but I know I've used it for a lot of years, but I use it a lot, and I think it's a valid statement. And listen, no quote that anybody comes up with is completely original in themselves. It comes from different things that they've seen and maybe quotes that other people have had, and then they mix them together. So I'll just tell you this one here. This is one I like to use a lot. Faith is not believing that God can do the impossible. Faith is believing that God can do just what he said he would do. And so in that, what we're talking about here is God told Abraham that in him all families of the earth would be blessed. So Abraham is believing. God's not believing something that's impossible. Abraham is believing that God can do just what he said he would do. And to him, that's not impossible. See, that's the point. A lot of times we think God needs to do what we want them to do. He says, if I just have faith, God will do this. Or if I have faith in God, he'll do this. But how many of us ever sat there and says, you know what? God said he would do this, so I believe him. And that's the end of the matter. I remember as missionaries when we went to the field, we didn't go to the field because we believed that our faith was anything, but we did believe that God was faithful. And he would do what he said he would do. He would never leave us or forsake us. He was omnipresent, so he's going to be there with us all the time. And we could go to him in prayer. If we didn't know what to pray for, we would pray for it and leave it up to the Lord. Whether he decided how he wanted to answer that prayer, we knew that he knew best, and we knew that he was good. We knew that he was powerful, and he could do anything he saw fit. But we also knew that God would never do anything that was not for our benefit. And so that's what we wanted to do. So God requires faith in order to bless. So let me read what I have here. Abraham was not going to obey God because he thought God was going to raise Isaac from the dead, but because he was going to keep his promise to Abraham to bless all the peoples of the earth through Isaac. That's why Abraham believed God. And Abraham believed him because he says, he looked out to the future and said, God's going to do it. I don't know how he's going to do it, but I believe he is, and so that's why I can obey him. And so that's what we need to keep in mind. Romans 4, verses 20 and 21 say this. He, talking about Abraham, did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convinced that what he had promised, he was able also to perform. So what he means here, now that promise here is talking about when he originally gave that promise to Abraham because he believed him that in him all families of the earth would be blessed and that a descendant would come through the line of Isaac. That's what that's referring to, not this particular event, but it's the same idea. He trusted God before, now he's getting ready to trust him again, and in the same way and in the same manner. So Abraham, just remember this, he's just like you and me. He was a man who had struggles, he had trials, he had to believe God, all kinds of things. He had left his family, his friends, his country to go to a land that God would show them, and he did it, and he obeyed God. Now God's asking him to do something else. I said, I want you to go to another place. I want you to take your son there, and I said, I want you to offer him as a sacrifice. And so Abraham said, okay, Lord, if that's what you say, I'll trust you in the matter. I'm sure that his mind had to be racing on how God was going to do this, because if Isaac was dead, where would the line of the deliverer come from? But he could also look back, too, in history and see, listen, that was what was happened to Abel. Abel died, and God provided Seth, and so on. And so we see these things going on and on. that God just continues to keep his promise. Let's see. God, let me say this. God has only one requirement, and he only had one requirement for Abraham, and that was to believe him. Abraham was to believe him. And as a result, God blessed him. As a result of that, Abraham was not trusting in his own faith. He was trusting in God's faithfulness to do what he said he would do. Now, I want you to contrast this with Adam and Eve. How Adam and Eve, this is an interesting contrast here, I think. Adam and Eve were sinless, and they chose to sin. Abraham is a sinner, and he chooses not to sin. That's an amazing thing, isn't it? Here, Adam and Eve, they were sinless. They had no flaws in them, and yet they chose to sin. But Abraham was a sinner, and yet he chose to obey God. He chose to believe him. So anyway, as a result of that, Abraham, he heard this command, so Abraham starts preparing to do what God wants him to do. So Genesis 22, verses 3 through 5 say this. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. So it's Abraham, Isaac, and 2 other young men. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So he gets up in the morning, he cuts the firewood and everything for the offering, and then they're going to the place that God tells him to go. Then on the 3rd day, and it took him 3 days to get there, on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go up there and worship, and we will come back to you." Now, I want you to understand something. This is really interesting. I'll be honest with you. I had never seen this till I just now read this, but it's something pretty exciting that tells me that he knows what God's going to do here. Or he doesn't know exactly what God's going to do, but he knows that God's going to do something special. It says this here. He says, now he rose up. He took got his donkey, got the wood, and got the young man to help him doing what he's doing. And he traveled for 3 days, came to this place. He says, then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. And Abraham said to his young men, the ones that came to help him, he says, you guys stay here and watch the donkey. The lad, or in other words, my son, and I will go up there and worship. We too are going up there to worship. And then what does he say? And we will come back to you. Not I will come back. We will come back. So it's interesting that he already had this in his mind. God's going to provide this. And maybe, I don't know all that he was going to do. I'm sure he was going to do just what God told him to do. But it's interesting that he says, and we will come back. He didn't say, and I will come back. So what do you think Isaac was thinking? And maybe this is something for Isaac also. So Genesis 22, verses 6 through 7 say this. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? So Isaac hasn't figured this thing out yet, So he's going there and says, okay, we're going up to offer these offerings, but we've got the wood, we've got the fire. Okay, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? So God had not told Isaac what he told Abraham. So God did not tell this to Isaac. So this is as much a test for Isaac as it is for Abraham. So God had not told Isaac what he had told Abraham, and Abraham had not told Isaac what God had told him. So that's kind of interesting. But Isaac understood some things here. He had seen a lot of sacrifices over his lifetime with his father, I'm sure, making them. And Isaac knew that to sacrifice, that there had to be something to sacrifice. So he knew that this lamb had to be there. Notice he talks about a lamb. He wasn't talking about bringing vegetables like Cain did. Remember how we talked about that? Isaac knew that in order to bring a sacrifice, it had to be an acceptable sacrifice, one that God would approve of. So he knew that this lamb was to come. But unlike Cain, he knew that this sacrifice, and like I said, had to be acceptable to God. So what was Abraham's response to Isaac there? Where's the sacrifice? In verse 8 of 22, it says this, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. Now, Abraham trusted God. That's for sure right there. But you know what? Isaac trusted his father. Now, Isaac may have been trusting God at this point too. But you know what? He had to have an awful lot of confidence in his dad, that his dad knew what was going on also. Can you imagine that? He's going up there and he's, okay, Dad, if that's what you say, that's good enough for me. So Isaac goes up on this mountain along with his father. Abraham trusted God, and I think Isaac trusted his father, his dad too. And so that's how this kind of went. So what were the Abraham believed and followed God's instructions. Let me tell you something. I've thought about this over the years. You know, sometimes we have a disease. We can get a bad disease or get something that makes us sick. I know my grandkids sometimes get some, little flus or whatever. They go on, they take them to the doctor. But you know what? And sometimes they get a prescription for that. But reading a prescription never makes anybody well. It's taking the prescription. And that's one of the things that you have to think about here. See, Abraham he's believing God, but his belief is shown by his actions. And it isn't that he can't believe without doing something, but he is showing us that he does believe. God has given us an example of somebody who does believe, who really understands who God is. And that's what all of these lessons for. Let me just stop for a minute here and just kind of regress a little bit. One of the reasons I've been doing these lessons all these months and stuff like that, it isn't because I want to sit down and just be busy in a room trying to put these out. It's because I really want people to understand who God really is, the creator of the universe, who owns everything that exists. And it's important that we understand that, because that is what helps determine how we respond to the trials that we come up in our lives. That we can trust God, that we can believe him and understand that he is the creator. He's the owner of everything that exists, and he wants to do what's best for us. So we work on that, and we want to understand that. So that's what's going on here. Abraham believes God. He's seen God act. He understands who God really is. And so he is acting in a way that it's in accordance with that understanding. Now, some people may not act, even though they're believers, they may not act that way, but that is more an issue of maturity rather than salvation or absolute dependence on God. Many people are immature. Immature people don't believe a lot of things. A lot of times, like our children don't. They don't sometimes believe us. Why? Because they're just not at that point. They haven't been through the trials. They haven't learned that God means what he says. So reading a prescription never made anybody well. It's following the instructions. That's what makes people well. So what is the next step in the instructions that God gives to Abraham? So in 22 verses 9 and 10, it says this: Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And then he says this: And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. So Abraham is there. He went to the place God told him to. He builds this altar. He lays the wood up on the altar, gets it ready. And then it says he binds his son Isaac and lays him up on the altar. Now, can you imagine this? This takes a lot of faith to do something like this. This is your only son. But excuse me for a second there. But just think of what kind of faith it took for Isaac. Isaac is the one that being offered as a sacrifice. And Isaac let his father bind him up. He could have run away. Abraham could have brought the young man up there to hold him and in place while he did all that, but he didn't. He told the young man to stay down. So it's just Isaac and his father Abraham. So Abraham binds him up and lays him up on the altar. And then it says, And then he laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. So that's what he's doing. He's there and he's getting ready and he's pulling that knife up and he's getting ready to lay it onto his son. I just think that is so amazing. It is amazing that Abraham believed God, but so did Isaac. That's an amazing thing to think about, isn't it? Would we be willing to do that for our son? Or would we be willing to do that for our fathers if they said that this was it? If your dad was a godly man, would you be willing, if God had spoken to him, and to let yourself be sacrificed? Anyway, so what did Abraham do? That's where we're going to finish next week. Now, I know many of you know the end of the story, but some of you may not. So next week we will continue on with this story and see what Abraham did. I just want to thank you all very much for listening to these. I really do this because I want to. I think it's important, some of this information. I know there's other speakers out there that are much better than I am. That's okay. I don't mind. I want you to have information to consider and to think about so that you walk away understanding who this person is who claims to be God. And as you understand who he is, you can grasp that and live by that and understand it and live that life that God wants you to live, to be an example to others and to bring others to maturity besides yourself. So, with that being said, please, if you think this is something worth listening to for others, tell them about it, tag them, let them know about it. You get on YouTube and just look up Doug Schaible, my last name, Schaible, and just have them get on there. And please have them subscribe. I think once I get up to 100 subscriptions, I can kind of change the name of that site to like Premature Bible Institute or whatever I want to change it to. And if you want to just listen to this on audio podcasts, get onto your favorite podcast app, whatever that might be, and just look up Premature Bible Institute, and you'll find it there. It's a little Bible with a leaf coming up out of it, and it has our mission logo on there. So just want to say thank you guys, and look forward to next week. Bye.